Hi, and welcome to the Smart Divorce podcast. I am very delighted to be joined this morning by Nicola Sharp-Jeffs. We have been trying to record this podcast for absolutely ages, so I'm so glad that she's been able to join me today. Nicola is the founder of Surviving Economic Abuse, which is a charity, and she's going to tell you much more about that over the course of the next 30 or 40 minutes that we're chatting together. Nicola, do you want to tell us a little bit more about you?
Sure. So as you said, I'm both the founder and chief exec at Surviving Economic Abuse, a charity I set up, having heard from so many victims and survivors about the economic impact of the domestic abuse they'd experienced and controlling tactics as part of the coercive behaviour that the perpetrator had used. And it just flummoxed me really that there was no real research or practice out there at the time. So to backtrack slightly, my career started in around 2006 in the domestic abuse sector when I started to have regular contact with victims and survivors of domestic abuse. So really it all stemmed from there, leading me to actually undertake a piece of research because I was doing my master's in women and child abuse at the time. And it just became a real passion for me because of the injustice that I saw victims and survivors experiencing and that ongoing impact of the economic abuse on their lives, decades later, really. So it just, created a passion to support and to try and make a difference in this space.
We're very glad that you have set up this amazing charity. Certainly, when I got into working with divorcing couples, I never, ever imagined that I would come upon so many people who've experienced coercive control or some form of abuse, not necessarily fists, but all sorts of, financial, economic abuse, as I say, coercive control, etc. So I think we should begin by probably defining economic abuse. So can you tell us how we define economic abuse?
Yes, of course, and perhaps it's a good opportunity to differentiate between economic and financial abuse as well.
Absolutely.
So financial abuse being about the control of money and finances, and economic abuse about being the control of money and finances and economic resources more broadly. So basically anything that money can buy. So we would include in that things like food, clothing, housing, transportation, tech, those resources that you need to get by on an everyday basis. And as I recognised at the beginning, certainly in 95% of domestic abuse cases that we're aware, there is this kind of economic controlling element within that experience. So it's more common than not. And we kind of see that behaviour working in three different ways, which again, perhaps challenges some myths and stereotypes around financial and economic abuse more broadly. So certainly we see restriction. So victims and survivors who aren't allowed a bank account, who have to ask for money, who have to ask for permission to use the car or to open the fridge and take food out of it, which kind of creates a dependency, which makes it very difficult for victims and survivors to kind of have the income available to them, that money that they need at short notice, or that resource they need at short notice, perhaps to leave, and then that makes rebuilding their life quite difficult if they haven't got access, perhaps to passwords to a bank account that was in their name, for example. But what we see more sort of increasingly are examples of exploitation and sabotage. So exploitation, very common, is where one partner refuses to contribute at all to household costs, for example. So the victim and survivor is kind of having to pay for everything. So in this case, they do have access to money and economic resources more broadly. It's just that they have no real control over how they're being used, because quite often the perpetrator insists on a particular kind of lifestyle, standard of living, which the victim and survivor is desperately trying to meet. And quite often we see the victim and survivor and their children often living in poverty, whilst the perpetrator has a much higher standard of living. And the victim and survivor might be working sort of multiple jobs in order to kind of meet the demands of the perpetrator. And of course, within the coercive controlling context, to fail to provide that lifestyle, could lead to physical, sexual violence. So there's a fear of what could happen if those demands aren't met. So we see that quite a bit, and we also see sabotage, where a victim or survivor again has money, finances, economic resources more broadly, but the perpetrator deliberately sabotages them through destroying possessions, doing things like disconnecting utilities, which then require sort of a reconnection fee. So they create a number of additional costs, which again absorb any available income that the victim or survivor does have. So alongside that kind of dependency, we see a lot of what we call instability to victims and survivors, who on paper might look to be doing quite well, but the reality is that their finances are really unstable. And again, that creates a situation very similar to dependency, where because they're not in control, it's very difficult for them to make decisions and to exit and to rebuild their lives, as I mentioned earlier.
Sounds absolutely horrendous, and I'm sure lots of us are struggling to believe that people behave like that, but it's more common than we think. What sometimes in those situations that you've talked about, is there also an aspect where the couple gets into a lot of debt because the person who's the victim is trying so desperately to make things work and to keep up that lifestyle that they actually end up in taking out loans and spending on credit cards, etc., just to maintain that lifestyle?
Certainly. So we call that coerced debt, and it takes many different forms. So as you just rightly identified, it might be that a survivor takes out credit or gets into debt to pay for things to appease the abuser, so the things that they're demanding. There's kind of multiple jobs are not enough once all of the household bills and the childcare etc has been paid for. So that's absolutely one reason why a victim survivor would get into debt. Through restriction or sabotage, money might be spent that be put aside for other things, which means the victim and survivor has to resort to credit, perhaps to pay for clothing. Money had been put aside, but the perpetrator stole or spent it without their knowledge. And we also see quite a lot of the perpetrator actually taking out credit and loans in the victim survivor's name, either without their knowledge, or they might suspect that that's the case, but again, to ask and to challenge would be dangerous for them. So we see it operating on lots of different levels, really.
It's horrendous, isn't it? And is there usually a move for a kind of progression through from different kind of abuses? So perhaps starting with financial, moving to economic, and eventually ending up in a more physical type of abuse?
I would say that economic abuse is probably one of the earliest forms of coercive and controlling behaviour, and it's unusual for it to not be alongside emotional abuse. So again, there's kind of real subtle controlling behaviours which you might not recognise, because certain behaviours, I guess, are to a certain extent ingrained in society. So this idea that if you are a couple, you automatically have a joint bank account. The perpetrator making comments, if a victim survivor wants to keep their own bank account, well, that demonstrates that you're not really committed to the relationship. I've given up my joint account and my personal account, why wouldn't you? So kind of really using, as I kind of said, also emotional kind of tactics to kind of start to bring that control about. So I would say economic, emotional, and like any form of control, that might be enough. But if a victim or survivor does challenge, then that might escalate into physical or sexual violence, as you say. But then also we see economic abuse either start or escalate post-separation, again, because it's what we describe as kind of a form of abuse that doesn't need physical contact. So obviously physical sexual abuse, you need to know where the person is, you need to be in the same space as them. But for economic abuse, it can happen virtually via technology. So it's one way in which a perpetrator can continue to exert that control even post-separation. So we sort of see it usually at the beginning, threading through, and then escalating, or if it hasn't started before, starting at the post-separation stage.
Right, okay. So if somebody recognises the sorts of things you've been saying and thinks, I think I'm in this position, and they're thinking about leaving, but in an economic abuse situation, it's incredibly difficult because they don't tend to have their own money. What options are available to them?
There are a number of options available, and I would say they're growing all the time. So of course the welfare system has always been that kind of safety net for victims and survivors who might be fleeing with nothing. So if they are in touch with a domestic abuse service, for example, or other specialist organisation that provides advice for people in these circumstances, and then that's sort of one route towards getting an independent income and rebuilding. That can be difficult if you've got a lot of assets, obviously. It's one of the difficulties that a lot of victims and survivors also have around legal aid in terms of getting the resource that they need for legal proceedings. So again, sort of a lot of work going into being able to show that you experienced domestic abuse for legal aid purposes. There has been some test cases around disregarding capital that people might have if there's an understanding of economic abuse, that whilst that person might have that asset on paper, they're not able to afford it right now. So we're starting to get a little bit more understanding, certainly in that space, of economic abuse. Increasingly, the banks and building societies are doing more. So listeners might have heard, for example, that TSB about a month or so ago announced that it provides a flee fund for its customers. So they'll provide up to £500 at short notice. That's something that we're calling on government to do for everybody. It shouldn't depend on when you bank, certainly. But even though financial institutions might not be very sort of open and market what they do for victims and survivors, certainly at Surviving Economic Abuse, we work with around sort of 20 banks or building societies who are doing work in this area. Certainly 30 firms and 40 brands are signed up to something called the Financial Abuse Code, which sets out minimum standards and principles in terms of how they will respond. So I would encourage listeners again to be in contact with their bank or building society if they need their support. We've got guidance on the Surviving Economic Abuse website about how best to do that. You'll get a better response if you perhaps phone up and ask to speak to the customer vulnerability team than you would, for example, just going into branch and speaking to someone behind a counter. So there is advice and guidance about how to do that. But certainly when you get to the right people, it's amazing what can be done to support victims and survivors in this space and to support them to regain that control moving forward as well, importantly. Employers are doing more in this space than ever before. There's something called the name escapes me for a moment.
It'll come back to you.
The Employers Initiative on Domestic Abuse, IDA for short. A number of corporates are signed up to them. They've brought domestic abuse into their employment policies, and sometimes that also includes economic support, and certainly off the back of COVID and the cost of living crisis, corporates, either as employers or people who have contact with customers who might be experiencing economic abuse, are doing more and more in this space. So there is that support available, and lots of other support which I probably failed to mention, but which again exists on the Surviving Economic Abuse website.
Fantastic. It can be so difficult, and there is research to suggest that it takes victims of abuse up to 7 times to leave an abusive relationship. So it's obviously not something to be taken lightly, that we think, well, why on earth are you staying when you're in that position? You should surely just leave. But it's not as simple as that, is it?
It's not as simple as that, and actually access to economic resources is one of the primary reasons given for why victims and survivors don't leave. Not always aware of the help that's available to them, certainly, but it's also the primary reason why a lot of victims and survivors go back, as I said, because perpetrators will continue to exert control post-separation. It is the most dangerous time for a victim or survivor. Again, it's another common misperception that just leaving means that the abuse will end. Sadly, it doesn't. And again, we often see it escalate. The vast majority of homicides happen at the point of separation or in the first 3 months afterwards. So again, it's really important that anyone experiencing this is supported to leave in a safe way. I'm not saying don't leave, absolutely leave, but it's not as easy as just leaving, certainly. And again, as I said, that control might escalate, and perpetrators might deliberately start using things like joint financial arrangements, taking victims and survivors back to court multiple times. That might be through the family court in terms of child contact, in addition to divorce proceedings, making things really, really difficult for the victim or survivor to rebuild their life and to be able to live independently and to have that economic independence that they do need. So it's about making sure that that right support is in place so that victims and survivors hopefully can separate sooner rather than later.
So difficult, isn't it? So you set up Surviving Economic Abuse, and you've mentioned a number of resources that are on your website. What does the charity do? What does it aim to do, and how does it support victims?
The mission of Surviving Economic Abuse is to raise awareness of this form of abuse, because not everybody is aware of it, and we seek to transform responses to it. So we're not a frontline domestic abuse organisation. We support frontline charities in that space because they provide that holistic response to a victim or survivor, which is really, really important. So what we do is build the capacity of those local services to be able to support victims and survivors. As I just referred to in the banking space, there might not be support available locally, but there is that kind of central place. So we occupy sort of an interesting space ourselves, I guess, in terms of the role that we can play to facilitate that contact. So, for example, we can facilitate a referral from a domestic abuse charity to, certainly at Lloyds Banking Group now, a specialist domestic and financial abuse team. So there's ways in which we can sort of help local services support victims and survivors. And that includes, you know, how to talk about economic abuse, to see the extent that the economic abuse might have taken, to identify areas where the victim or survivor will need support. We also work with money and debt advice organisations. To your question earlier, Tamsin, we know again that of that 95% of those experiencing economic abuse, 60% will have been coerced into debt as a consequence of that. So that's a common support need as well. But that's regulated advice. So a domestic abuse service can't give advice around debt. So that needs to be done by a regulated advisor. And again, it's really important that advisors in that space have a really good understanding of economic abuse and domestic abuse more broadly, because first of all, they must do that work safely, especially if the victim survivor is still with the perpetrator. So one of the things that they'll do with victims and survivors looking to leave, for example, is to kind of work through a budget to say, actually, what could you access? You know, to kind of provide that confidence, you know, that there will be the means to leave and to live independently. And again, the perpetrator is likely to have told the victim or survivor that, you know, there's nothing that anyone can do and there's no support available. So that work's really, really important, but needs to be done safely. And also in a way that's non-victim blaming, because if a money or debt advice organisation doesn't know that someone's experienced domestic abuse, they might say, well, you know, how did you get into this position? You're not very good at managing your money. You know, they won't recognise that there's been a complete lack of control. And again, it's really important then to frame interventions in a really empowering way. So giving victims and survivors a range of options rather than suggesting they go down a particular path, because again, it enables the victim or survivor to take back control. So we'll do that. We work in the financial services space as well, as I've already mentioned, working really closely with banks and building societies who are signed up to the Financial Abuse Code. And then we also work with UK Finance, which is the membership body that has implemented that code. And we work with the regulator, the Financial Conduct Authority, because that code sits within the Financial Conduct Authority's guidance around supporting vulnerable consumers, and something new, which is just coming in, called the Consumer Duty as well, which is looking to respond not just to problems arising from economic abuse, but also to think about actually how products and systems are designed, which kind of help facilitate inadvertently this continuing control. So that's another sort of really important area of work. So we kind of work on individual advocacy to support those who are working with victims and survivors to kind of do their very best in where we are now. We work with industry and regulators to sort of constantly be pushing the boundaries. So we recognise where some of the barriers might be, for example, some of the challenges that organisations can't respond to, so where you kind of need that change perhaps in industry or regulatory guidance, and where we can't influence in that space, then we will talk to government. So we do a lot of work, certainly with the Home Office, who is responsible for the cross-governmental response to domestic abuse, and also sort of related departments, so people like the Department for Work and Pensions, certainly around welfare benefits and child support, for example, the Ministry of Justice around legal aid. The acronym is BAE. I think it's Business, Enterprise and Industrial Strategy, I think I'm right in saying, in terms of the employer response and what can be done to support consumers, and then people like the Treasury in terms of HMRC. So yeah, lots of different levels of advocacy to support victims and survivors. And we provide resources for those professionals in those spaces. And we also capture best practice and knowledge for victims and survivors for self-advocacy as well. And all those resources sit on our website. And I should also say that we do have a frontline partnership with Money Advice Plus. So that provides a national casework service and support line for victims and survivors. And again, all the details to be referred to that are on our website. And I've mentioned the frontline partnership we have at Lloyds Banking Group. One of the surviving economic abuse teams sits within their specialist financial and domestic abuse team as well. So we're always able to kind of take that evidence from the frontline partnerships into the advocacy and campaigning work that we do.
Crikey. There's such a lot going on. Such a lot going on. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's great that the charity exists and that it's doing so much work. I just want to just go back for a second to you. So you mentioned you work with a lot of the banks and building societies on and with the FCA with regards to products. And I know about the code that's been brought in for banks, which is fantastic. And it's every step that's taken towards making things easier is a good thing. We talked earlier about debt, and one of the things that tends to happen is the use of not paying debt in order to destroy the other person's credit, or obviously if the victim moves out of their family home and doesn't have access to money and isn't able to pay their share of the mortgage, that they end up in a situation with poor credit. Is there anything I know I'm putting you on the spot with this because we haven't talked about this. Is there anything happening with regards to helping victims to not have, because that poor credit isn't necessarily a result of their own doing and their own not wishing to pay debt down, but actually impacts them potentially for years and years to come, if not for the rest of their lives, depending on how far that non-payment's gone.
Absolutely. So we see that as a form of economic sabotage, that destruction of someone's credit rating and that impact that it then has, as you just outlined, Tamsin. So certainly banks have to deal with the issue of coerced debt as part of the financial abuse code. In some cases, they will write off the debt, and we have created something called the Economic Abuse Evidence Form, which we're piloting with our partner Money Advice Plus, because again, on average, a victim or survivor will have 5 different creditors that they need to contact, and that can be really difficult with everything else going on when someone's fled from abuse, whether it's the criminal justice system or family and more practical issues as well. So this form is filled in by a qualified debt advisor. And again, it's really important to get that advice in the round. And then that is presented as evidence of economic abuse to the creditor, and then they make a decision based on that. So in some situations, we're able to sort of remove the debt completely. Again, because banks and building societies are starting to really understand this issue, certainly internally, they have their own credit rating systems, and they will make decisions outside of policy. So if they understand a victim or survivor is in a particular place because of the abuse that they experience, they might look at their lending regulations. Sometimes they might look at affordability in terms of mortgages and go by evidence, saying, well, actually, this is a joint mortgage, but actually we can see that you've been paying it for years. Even if you fail our affordability check for a mortgage, we can see actually you can afford it. So there is, some flex there, certainly. But more broadly, we're working with industry and people like Equifax and Experian to think about what we can do. And certainly I know it's an issue that UK Finance are really keen on exploring this year. So it's really live, and as you say, it's really important that we address this, not only because it's important to repair that credit rating, but to create that safety, you need to ensure victims and survivors have lots of different strands of income. And if you think about how we all perhaps rely on credit from time to time, it stops us being in difficult situations where we might have to borrow money or do things that we don't want to for money. It's really important that victims, survivors have access to lots of different types of income. So it might seem a bit mad saying that someone should be able to borrow money moving forward, but again, to your point, Tamsin, this is being in control of that borrowing as opposed to someone else being in control of it for you.
No, you're absolutely right. And people do need to be able to have access to credit. Mortgages are how most of us buy houses. Very few people I know are able to save up to get to a point where they can afford any sort of property that they buy on their own, and without that good credit history, which could have been completely trashed by the other person. If you have any joint credit with another person and they stop paying, you either have to continue to pay the entire debt yourself, or you stop paying and just pay your share, or you might be in a position, if you've moved out of the home that you shared with that person, where you can't afford to pay for your new lodgings and your old family mortgage, and you end up with a poor credit file through essentially really no fault of your own. And I think it is time that we did look at that, and it is something that I don't think you really become aware of until you start being involved in people who are victims of this kind of abuse. I know we spoke to Rosie, whose name escapes me. I'm sure you know who I'm talking about.
Rosie Lyles.
That's her. Rosie
Lyles.
Yes. Yeah. I think we spoke to her last series, and she's a huge advocate for all of this work, and I know she's put in a huge amount of work herself with the banks to help move forward with these changes, which we just quite simply need to see, don't we? It's as simple as that. So we're coming to the end of our chat for today. I just wondered if you had any sort of final thoughts on if you're in this position, kind of I guess a broad outline of where to, if you feel like this is you, where do you start? Where do you go? What would the actions that you should be thinking about taking might be?
Absolutely. So I would say first port of call would be the Surviving Economic Abuse website. So if you think this is something that you might be experiencing, we've got sort of an identification tool on there. So it's something that you can kind of go through and establish whether or not this is reflective of your experience or not. And then what that does is start to flag to you different types of resources that might be helpful for you. So organisations that you can be in contact with, things that you can do yourself, how to be in contact with bank or building society, as has been mentioned. So I think, as I said, as a first port of call, that's really helpful. For anyone who is in immediate fear and is concerned about their safety, the National Domestic Abuse Helpline is really important. If you have an immediate concern, obviously you would call the police, but if you kind of need help in an emergency situation, in terms of leaving, perhaps you feel that you need support to do that, and you might want to access a refuge, which again is kind of a secret location for people who feel that the perpetrator might try to find them, that their life is at risk. You can access support by that mechanism as well. We do provide peer support surviving economic abuse, so we've got Survivors Forum that victims and survivors can join. So that's kind of a closed platform where conversations can be had about experiences, and people kind of discuss what they've done and what's worked and what hasn't done. So that's kind of a nice practical support mechanism, but also kind of provides some emotional and peer support at the same time. And then, as I said, there are sort of many kind of linked sort of issues and organisations, whether it be in the legal sphere. So again, there's information about legal organisations. If you're listening to this as a professional yourself, we do have information for legal professionals as well, in terms of actually understanding the nature of economic abuse and the impact that might have on your client, and how best to identify sort of remedies for them. So again, all that information is on the Surviving Economic Abuse website as well. And we also run kind of an info at mechanism. So where we can't provide advice, we can signpost. So if sort of having looked at all those resources and spoken to organisations, you might still be struggling, you're very welcome to drop us an email, as I said, at info@survivingeconomicabuse.org, and we can sort of use our contacts and knowledge to signpost too.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for that. That was a really comprehensive rundown of what people can do, and we will put the link to your website and also the National Domestic Abuse Helpline on the show notes as well, so that if anybody does want to, or rather need to, use those resources, you will be able to find them easily in the show notes. It just remains for me to thank you, Nicola, very much for joining me today. It's been a really useful podcast. I'm sure our listeners will have found it very helpful as well.
I hope so. Thank you for inviting me.